The HOA Karen kept stealing my firewood, so I came up with a revenge plan to fill it with gunpowder and blow up her fireplace. But she didn't just take my wood. She stole the hand-carved memorial I made for my late firefighter son and put it in her own yard like a trophy. She laughed in my face, fined me, and threatened to take my house. So I gave her exactly what she wanted, a fresh pile of my best wood. She thought she was getting free heat for the winter. What she didn't know is that she was about to light the fuse that would expose every last one of her dirty secrets. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments, because this is just the beginning. And if you believe no homeowner should have to fight a bully with a clipboard just to feel safe, hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss another story of justice served. The air had that sharp, clean bite to it, the kind that promised a deep winter was settling in. It was barely 6 in the morning, the sky a pale, bruised purple over the rooftops of the cul-de-sac. I pulled on my old work coat, the zipper sticking like it always did, and stepped out onto the back porch. The cold went right through my socks. My first thought, same as every morning, was to get a fire going for Lisa. She liked to have her coffee by the hearth, watching the flames. I walked over to the woodpile, stacked neat and tight against the side of the garage, and stopped dead. The pile was shorter. Again. Not by a lot, just a few logs missing from the top layer of seasoned oak. This was the third time in a month. The first time, I thought I'd just miscounted. The second, I figured it was a neighbor in a pinch. Maybe their furnace went out. But 3 times? That's not a coincidence. That's a pattern. I felt a familiar knot of frustration tighten in my gut. This was my wood. I'd split it, stacked it, and seasoned it myself. It was one of the few things I still had the patience for. But it wasn't just the wood. I scanned the pile again, and a cold dread washed over me that had nothing to do with the morning frost. The sign was gone. My heart hammered against my ribs. It was a simple thing, a small piece of cedar I'd carved myself. It just said Branson Firewood, in clean block letters. Lisa had painted a little flame on it. It wasn't much, but it was for him. For our son, Michael. He was a firefighter. He'd loved the smell of a wood fire more than anything. After we lost him, I started this pile. It felt like keeping a light on for him. That little sign wasn't just marking a stack of wood, it was marking a memory, and someone had taken it. The wood I could replace, that I couldn't. A quiet rage, colder and harder than the frozen ground, started to build inside me. This wasn't about a few logs anymore. This was a violation. Someone had walked onto my property, into a space that was more of a memorial than a woodshed, and took something that meant the world to me. I stood there for a long time, just staring at the empty space where the sign used to hang, the morning chill forgotten. Just then, I heard the click-clack of shoes on the pavement coming up my driveway. I knew who it was, without even turning around. Marcia Kenton, HOA president, self-appointed queen of the cul-de-sac. She was always dressed like she was on her way to a board meeting, even at dawn. Today was no exception. Pressed slacks, a crisp blouse, and a clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield. She had a smile plastered on her face, but it never reached her eyes. Her eyes were always calculating, always scanning for violations. "Good morning, Tom," she said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "Getting an early start, I see." I just grunted, not in the mood for small talk. She glanced at my woodpile, her smile tightening just a fraction. "You know, the Community Appearance Committee has been discussing unapproved firewood storage. Section 4B of the bylaws is quite specific about uniform stacking and placement. We wouldn't want the neighborhood looking untidy." I turned to face her fully, letting her see the cold anger in my eyes. "Someone's been helping themselves to my wood, Marcia. They took the sign I had hanging here, too." She feigned a look of concern, tilting her head. "Oh, dear. Are you sure? Sometimes we miscount. Or maybe it's just some local kids playing a prank." The condescension in her voice was like sandpaper on my nerves. She was talking to me like I was a confused old man. "I don't miscount," I said, my voice low and steady. "And kids don't steal seasoned oak in the middle of the night." She just gave a little shrug, a dismissive flick of her wrist. "Well, I'll keep an eye out." In the meantime, I'll be sending you a notice about the firewood, just a friendly reminder to keep things in line with the community standards." With that, she turned and click-clacked her way back down the driveway, leaving me standing there fuming. She didn't care about the theft. She cared about control. That night, I didn't sleep. I just kept seeing that empty spot where Michael's sign should have been. Lisa saw how much it was eating at me. She knew what that sign meant. "We'll make another one, Tom," she said softly, putting her hand on my arm. But it wasn't the same. This wasn't about the object. It was about the act, the disrespect. The next day, I drove to the hardware store. I wasn't going to let this happen again. I've spent my whole life fixing things, from busted engines in the army to faulty wiring in my own workshop. This was just another problem that needed a solution. I bought a high-powered motion sensor floodlight and a trail camera, the kind hunters use. It was waterproof, battery-operated, and had night vision. Back home, I spent the afternoon setting it all up. I mounted the floodlight high on the garage eave, angled perfectly to blast the entire woodpile with light. Then I found the perfect spot for the camera, hidden inside a birdhouse I'd made years ago. The lens looked right through the entrance hole. It was a perfect disguise. Anyone who stepped near that pile after dark would get their picture taken, clear as day. I felt a small flicker of hope, the first I'd felt in days. This would solve it. I'd get a clear shot of the thief, and that would be the end of it. No more arguments, no more condescending remarks from Marcia, just proof. A week went by. The woodpile remained untouched. The light hadn't gone off once. I started to think maybe the thief had been scared off, that just the sight of the new floodlight was enough. Then, on the 8th night, I was woken up by a brilliant flash of white light from the backyard. The floodlight. It stayed on for a full minute, then clicked off, plunging the yard back into darkness. My heart started pounding. I got him. I waited until the morning, my mind racing. I wanted to check the camera right away, but I made myself wait, go through my routine, make the coffee, kiss Lisa goodbye as she left for her volunteer shift at the hospital. Only then did I go out to the birdhouse and carefully retrieve the small memory card from the camera. I took it into my workshop, the one place I could think clearly. I slid the card into my laptop and clicked open the video file. The screen flickered to life, showing the grainy, black and white view of my woodpile. A timestamp in the corner read 2:17 a.m. For a few seconds, there was nothing but the silent image of the stacked wood. Then, a figure stepped into the frame. My breath caught in my throat. It was a person, their face obscured by the shadows. They reached for a log, and at that exact moment, the motion sensor kicked in. The world went white as the floodlight blasted the yard. The figure flinched, turning their head for just a second. And in that split second, I saw the face. It was Marcia Kenton. There she was, clear as day, her perfectly styled hair, her smug face now twisted in a snarl of annoyance at the light. She was standing on my property, in the middle of the night, stuffing my firewood into a canvas bag. She paused, looked around, and then defiantly grabbed 2 more logs before scurrying away, disappearing into the darkness just as quickly as she'd appeared. I just sat there, staring at the frozen image on the screen. It wasn't kids. It wasn't a mistake. It was the HOA president. The woman who fined me for my grass being half an inch too long was a common thief, stealing from me under the cover of darkness. The frustration I'd felt before was gone. It was replaced by a cold, sharp, and absolute rage. The game had just changed. I walked into the community meeting with a knot in my stomach and a video on my phone. The meeting was in the clubhouse basement, a windowless room with beige walls, fluorescent lights that hummed, and the faint smell of stale coffee and disinfectant. Marcia was at the head of a long folding table, flanked by the other 2 board members, Sandra Reeves, the treasurer, who wouldn't meet anyone's eye, and Carl Jensen, a beefy guy who wore his HOA safety officer windbreaker like it was a police uniform. A handful of other homeowners were scattered in the cheap plastic chairs, looking bored. I waited until the agenda moved to new business. I stood up, my hands steady, my voice calm. I'd been a mechanic in the army, I knew how to report a problem without letting emotion cloud the facts. I'd like to report a repeated theft of private property, I began. Over the past month, firewood has been taken from my property on 3 separate occasions. The last time, a personal item of sentimental value was also stolen. Marcia looked up from her notes, her pen poised. "And do you have any evidence of this, Tom?" she asked, her tone implying she was humoring a child. "I do," I said. "I installed a security camera. I held up my phone. It recorded the thief in the act." A few of the other homeowners perked up. This was more interesting than the new pet waste disposal policy. Marcia's smile didn't falter, but a flicker of something cold passed through her eyes. I didn't play the video. I didn't need to. Not yet. I was giving her a chance to do the right thing. It was a mistake. She let out a small, condescending laugh. "Oh, Tom, that wasn't theft. That was a community service." The room went quiet. I just stared at her. "I'm sorry?" She flipped through her binder with an air of practiced authority. According to Bylaw 4B, subsection C, excess combustible materials stored in a non-uniform manner can be considered a fire hazard. I was simply conducting an excess wood cleanup as part of my duties as president. It's for the safety of the entire community. She looked around the room as if expecting applause. Carl Jensen nodded seriously. Sandra just kept staring at her notepad. The lie was so bald-faced, so ridiculous, that for a second I was speechless. My woodpile was stacked tighter than a Jenga tower. "You came onto my property at 2 in the morning, I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "That's not cleanup. That's trespassing. And thieving." Marcia's smile vanished. "Your tone is becoming hostile, Tom. I'm going to have to ask you to respect the committee." Then she looked down at her notes and delivered the finishing blow. "In fact, I have a notice for you right here. For non-uniform stacking of firewood, that will be a $250 fine." She slid a piece of paper across the table toward me. It was a pre-printed form with my name and the fine amount filled in with her perfect, sharp handwriting. The room was silent. I could feel every eye on me. I didn't take the paper. I just turned and walked out, the sound of my own blood roaring in my ears. My route home took me past her house. It was a corner lot, the lawn a perfect, manicured green carpet. And there, sitting next to her pristine, white-painted porch swing, was my son's memorial sign. She hadn't just stolen it. She had defaced it. The beautiful, raw cedar I had carefully carved was covered in a thick, sloppy coat of glossy white paint. She had turned my memorial into a cheap lawn ornament. The carved letters of Branson Firewood were barely visible under the paint, like a ghost. Michael's flame was just a red smudge. All the air went out of my lungs. The anger from the meeting evaporated, replaced by a deep, hollow ache that was sickeningly familiar. It was the same feeling I had the day they told me about the warehouse fire. A piece of my son, a piece of my heart, had been taken and desecrated by this petty, soulless woman. This wasn't about bylaws or firewood anymore. This was a desecration. Back in my workshop, I sat for hours, just staring at the wall. The fight had gone out of me, but I had to try one more time to do it the right way. I spent the evening typing up a formal complaint to the HOA board, detailing the theft, the trespassing, and the misuse of her authority. I included a link to the trail cam video. I explained what that sign meant to me and my wife. I thought, maybe if the other 2 board members saw the proof, saw the human cost, they'd overrule her. The next day, my neighbor Earl stopped by while I was out in the yard. He was a retired firefighter, a good man who knew Michael. He'd been at the meeting. He leaned against the fence, his face grim. "Saw what she did, Tom," he said quietly. "That wasn't right." I just nodded, too choked up to speak. "Don't let her get away with it," he said, before patting my shoulder and heading back to his house. His quiet support was the only thing that kept me from feeling completely alone. 2 weeks later, the response came. It was a crisp, white envelope with the HOA letterhead. I opened it with trembling hands. My complaint was dismissed. The board, they wrote, had found Marcia Kenton to be acting within her presidential duties. They accepted her story about the fire hazard cleanup without question. The letter ended by informing me that I was being issued an additional fine of $500 for aggressive behavior and making baseless accusations at the community meeting. If the total of $750 was not paid within 30 days, they would place a lien on my property, my house. The house Lisa and I had lived in for 40 years. The house we brought Michael home to from the hospital. They were threatening to take my home over a stack of firewood and a stolen sign. That night, I couldn't stay inside. I went out and stood by the woodpile. The security light was off. The thief had no reason to come back. She had what she wanted. I looked at the half-empty space, at the dark, silent houses around me, and I felt a switch flip inside my head. The hope I had in the system, in reason, in decency, it was gone. It had died in that windowless room and was buried under a coat of white paint on Marcia Kenton's lawn. I understood then. This wasn't about wood. It wasn't about bylaws. It was about power. She was taking pieces of my life, piece by piece, just to prove that she could. And the rules were just the hammer she used to do it. Standing there in the cold night air, I made a promise to myself. I wasn't going to let her win. If I don't stop her now, I thought, she'll take everything. The time for playing by her rules was over. The spark of revenge had been lit, and I knew exactly how I was going to make it burn. The official letters started a few days later. They came in crisp HOA envelopes, delivered with the kind of bureaucratic precision designed to make you feel small. The first was a notice of violation for a loose gutter screw on the back of my house. I had to get a ladder to even see the damn thing. The notice included a blurry, zoomed-in photograph. The next one was for unsafe workshop wiring. My workshop wiring was cleaner and safer than the grid at City Hall. I did it myself to code 20 years ago and checked it every season. They were fishing. It was harassment, plain and simple. A paper-cut war to bleed me dry with fines or force me to surrender. The worst part was how they got the pictures. I was in my shop one afternoon when I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. It was Carl Jensen, Marcia's pet enforcer, standing on a stepladder, leaning over my back fence with his phone, snapping pictures. He wore his mirrored sunglasses and that stupid safety officer windbreaker. He looked like a man who failed the police academy entrance exam and never got over it. He wasn't even subtle. When he saw me looking, he just gave me a smug little nod and climbed down. He was untouchable, and he knew it. Marcia was using him to invade my privacy, to hunt for any crack she could use to stick a new fine in. This wasn't about community standards anymore. This was a siege. I got the bill for the gutter and the wiring on the same day as the third notice. This one for unauthorized vehicle maintenance, because the hood of my old pickup was up while I checked the oil. Another $150. I now owed them $900. I could pay it, but that felt like admitting guilt. It felt like letting them win. Lisa was getting anxious. She saw the letters pile up on the counter and the worry etched deeper lines into her face. "Tom, just pay it," she'd plead. "It's not worth the stress. It's not worth the house." But I knew if I paid, it would never stop. It would be something else next week, and the week after that. You don't stop a bully by giving them your lunch money. One morning, I took the 3 notices, a can of bright red enamel paint I used for marking tools, and a brush out to the front yard. My fence was solid cedar, weathered to a nice silver gray. I found a clean, flat section facing the street, and in big, clear block letters, I painted, "Paid in full." It was a stupid kind of perfect. The next morning, I saw people slowing down their cars to look. By noon, a picture of it was circling online. A guy a few streets over, a retired Marine, had posted it in the local veterans Facebook group with the caption, "One of our own fighting the good fight against the clipboard commandos." The post blew up. Hundreds of comments poured in, people sharing their own horror stories about Marcia and our HOA. For the first time, I realized I wasn't alone in this. The support felt good, like a warm front moving in after a long freeze. But that fence post drew a line down the middle of our quiet little street. The community fractured. Half the neighborhood gave me a quiet thumbs up when they drove by, or a supportive nod when we crossed paths at the grocery store. Earl was my biggest supporter, dropping by with coffee and telling me to give 'em hell. The other half, though, got scared. They started crossing the street to avoid me, refusing to make eye contact. They were worried about retaliation, afraid Marcia's all-seeing eye would turn on them next. Her power was built on that fear, and I had just painted a giant target on my back, and by extension, on theirs. The pressure was building. Marcia wasn't going to take that kind of public defiance lying down. I knew her next move would be bigger, more aggressive. So, I started planning my own. I retreated to my workshop. It was the one place that was truly mine. A sanctuary of order and logic where every tool had its place, and every problem had a mechanical solution. The smell of sawdust and machine oil calmed me down, helped me think. I pushed aside my woodworking projects and cleared my main bench. This was a new kind of project, one that required a different set of skills I hadn't used in years. I dug out an old footlocker from under the stairs, one I hadn't opened since I left the service. Inside, underneath old uniforms, were my old schematics and training manuals. I pulled out a blueprint. The paper yellowed and creased. It was a design for a specialized campfire starter system I'd developed for wildfire safety drills. It was a way to create a massive, instantaneous flash of heat to ignite damp kindling without using volatile liquids. The core of it was a contained, directional burst of pressure. Beside the blueprint, I laid out the materials I'd gathered. Short lengths of hollowed-out metal pipe sealed at one end, canisters of flash powder, the kind used in firefighter training simulations and theatrical special effects. Completely legal, but impressive when used correctly. My hands, which had felt clumsy with anger for weeks, were steady again. I wasn't building a weapon. I was building an answer. I was building a trap, and Marcia's own greed was going to be the bait. I knew she'd be back. She was too arrogant, too obsessed, to leave that woodpile alone, especially now that I'd publicly embarrassed her. So, I started making new logs, replacements for the ones she'd taken. They looked like perfect, seasoned oak, but they were different, very different. 2 nights later, my phone buzzed with an alert from the trail cam. I opened the live feed, my heart hammering in my chest. There she was. The grainy, green-hued image showed her at my side gate. But this time, she wasn't just sneaking. In her hands, she held a pair of bolt cutters. I watched, frozen, as she positioned them around the heavy chain lock. The sound came through my phone's speaker, a sickening scrape of metal on metal, and then a loud, final snap. The chain fell away. The gate swung open. She had just escalated from a petty thief to a criminal, and I had it all on camera. The morning after she cut my lock, the official letter arrived. It wasn't just a fine this time. It was a formal, mandatory cleanup order. Taped to it was a photograph Carl must have taken, showing my paid-in-full artwork on the fence. The letter declared my fence to be graffiti and a blight on the community aesthetic. It also cited the old violations, the gutter, the wiring, the pickup truck, as evidence of my continued willful disregard for community standards. The final paragraph was the hammer blow. I had 10 days to repaint the fence to HOA-approved colors, remove the hazardous firewood pile entirely, and pay all outstanding fines. If I failed to comply, the HOA would initiate foreclosure proceedings. They were making their move to take my house. The bolt cutters were just the start. This order was the legal artillery. I felt a surge of pure, white-hot fury, but I shoved it down. Anger was a luxury I couldn't afford. I needed to think. I called the HOA's legal firm, a number listed at the bottom of the letter. I thought maybe I could talk to a lawyer, a human being who understood actual law, not just Marcia's petty kingdom. Maybe if I showed him the videos, the theft, the bolt cutters, he'd see reason. The lawyer who took my call sounded young and profoundly bored. I explained the situation calmly, factually. I told him about the targeted harassment, the theft, and the clear conflict of interest. The lawyer let me finish, then sighed into the phone. "Mr. Branson," he said, his voice flat, I've reviewed President Kenton's filings. Technically, according to the covenants you signed when you bought your house, she's within her rights. The board has broad discretion on aesthetic matters. I asked him about the video of her stealing my wood. She claims it was hazard abatement, he recited, like he was reading from a script. And the bolt cutters? Necessary to access the property for a compliance inspection after you failed to respond to previous notices. Every door was slamming shut in my face. They had an answer for everything. A lie wrapped in a bylaw. They had twisted the rules into a weapon, and there was no one to stop them. My rage curdled into a cold, heavy despair. It felt like drowning. That night, the fight finally drained out of me. The weight of it all, the fines, the threats, the constant feeling of being watched. It was too much. Lisa found me in the living room, just sitting in the dark, staring at the empty hearth. She sat beside me, not saying anything for a long time. Then she put her hand on mine. It was trembling. "Tom," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "maybe we should just sell. We can move, go somewhere quiet, where no one can bother us." My heart broke a little more. She was asking me to surrender our home of 40 years, the home we built our life in, the home filled with memories of Michael, his crayon marks still faint on the wall in his old room. And the worst part was, for the first time, I almost agreed. I was tired. I was 62 years old. Maybe I was too old for this fight. Maybe she was right. Losing the house was one thing. Losing Lisa to the stress was another. I looked at her tired face, the worry in her eyes, and I felt like a complete failure. I had let this woman, this petty tyrant, poison the one place on earth we were supposed to be safe. We sat in silence, the unspoken defeat hanging in the air between us. The next morning, I was sitting on the back steps, nursing a cup of coffee and the hollow feeling in my chest, when Earl came over. He didn't say hello, just handed me a steaming mug and sat down beside me. We watched the sun come up over the rooftops, the silence comfortable, familiar. He knew. I didn't have to say a word. Finally, he turned to me, his expression serious. "Years ago, on that big industrial fire, the one downtown, my hose line got snagged, and the ceiling was about to come down on me. I was ready to pack it in. I remembered that fire. I'd been outside, running the pump panel." "You didn't," I said. "No," Earl said, taking a sip of coffee. "Because your kid, Michael, crawled under a falling beam to cut me loose. He looked at me and said, 'You taught me never to lose a fight to a piece of broken equipment.' Well, you taught me never to lose a fight to a clipboard, brother." His words hit me harder than any legal notice. He was right. What was I doing? I'd faced down enemy fire, repaired engines in the middle of sandstorms, and taught hundreds of young men and women how to be disciplined and effective. Now I was going to let some woman with a binder and a mean streak run me out of my own home? The despair began to burn away, replaced by a hard, clear resolve. Later, Earl followed me into my workshop. I hadn't touched my special project in days, and the pieces lay on my workbench, covered in a thin layer of sawdust. He walked over and picked up one of the logs. It looked and felt just like a piece of oak, but he was a firefighter. He knew wood. He knocked on it. It was hollow. "What's this?" he asked, his eyes sharp. I took the log from him and unscrewed the nearly invisible cap at one end. Inside, it was packed with a dense, gray powder. Earl sniffed it. "That's not sawdust," he said. "Preservative mix," I lied, not wanting to worry him. "Keeps the bugs out." He looked at me, a long, steady gaze. He knew I was lying, but he didn't push. He just set the log down. "Well," he said with a small smile, "I bet they'll burn bright." His trust was all the permission I needed. After he left, I went to work. I wasn't just building a handful of trick logs anymore. I was building a whole arsenal. A meticulous, calculated montage of preparation began. Day after day, I was in my shop. I took my best-looking logs, the perfectly seasoned split oak that Marcia seemed to love so much, and I carefully hollowed them out. It was slow, precise work. Then I filled them, not with anything deadly, not with gunpowder. That was just anger talking. This was strategy. I filled them with my own custom mixture, based on those old training schematics. It was mostly magnesium powder and aluminum filings, stuff you could buy at any decent chemical supply store. It was the core ingredient of flash powder, used in training simulations to mimic explosions without the actual concussive force. It would create a huge, brilliant, and, most importantly, harmless flash of light and a massive cloud of smoke. It would be loud. It would be terrifying, but it wouldn't hurt anyone. It was designed for one thing: to put on a show. A very, very big show. I worked until my hands ached, sealing each log so perfectly you couldn't tell it from a real one. I stacked the regular wood back on the pile outside, but interspersed throughout, I placed my special logs. They were a minefield of embarrassment, waiting for her. She had cut my lock. She had threatened my home. She had declared war. Fine. Now she was going to get one. The invitation was a command, not a request. It arrived on embossed HOA letterhead, announcing the annual Community Harmony Barbecue to be held on Marcia Kenton's perfectly manicured back lawn. Attendance wasn't mandatory in writing, but everyone knew it was. It was a loyalty test. Lisa didn't want to go. The thought of being in that woman's space, making small talk while our son's desecrated memorial sat just a few feet away, made her physically ill. But I told her it was important. We had to go. We had to act like nothing was wrong. The key to my plan wasn't just the logs. It was making sure everyone was there to see what happened. Earl agreed to come with us, a solid, calming presence at my side. He showed up wearing his old firefighter's union polo shirt, a subtle act of solidarity that I appreciated more than words could say. I, for my part, brought a new walking stick. It was a sturdy piece of hickory I'd been working on, with a smooth, comfortable grip. I'd told Lisa I needed it for my knee, which had been acting up. In reality, my knee was fine. But nestled just below the handle, sealed and nearly invisible, was a tiny, wide-angle camera. The battery was fully charged. The memory card was empty and waiting. Marcia's backyard was a shrine to suburban perfection. The grass was an unnatural shade of green. The flower beds were arranged with military precision, and a string of white lights twinkled over a patio that looked like it had been scrubbed with a toothbrush. Marcia herself was in her element, flitting between guests with a tray of appetizers, her voice a high, chirping sound of false welcome. She was wearing a spotless white pantsuit, a commander reviewing her troops. She made a big show of greeting us, giving Lisa an air kiss near her cheek. "Tom, Lisa, so glad you could make it. I was worried you might be too busy with your fence project." Her smile was pure venom. I just nodded, leaning on my walking stick. "Wouldn't miss it, Marcia." I kept my voice neutral, cordial. I was a mechanic. I knew that you don't start revving the engine until everything is in place. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the lawn, Marcia gathered everyone onto the patio. The air was getting chilly, and she was clearly setting the stage for the main event. She stood near her large, stone outdoor fireplace, a grand affair that dominated the entire space, and stacked neatly in the ornate iron grate were my logs. She had taken the bait. My trail cam had recorded her just 2 nights before, making another late-night trip, helping herself to the fresh pile of firewood I had so kindly restocked for her. She had picked the best ones, the perfectly round, clean-cut logs, my special logs. She clapped her hands together for attention. "As you all know," she began, beaming, "our community is committed to a greener future. That's why I started our new EcoWood program." A few people nodded politely. "I've been collecting and distributing sustainably sourced, pre-seasoned firewood to ensure we're all heating our homes responsibly." She gestured to the logs in her fireplace. This beautiful oak, for instance, was reclaimed from a potential community fire hazard. It's all about sustainability and community compliance. I watched the faces in the crowd. A few of my supporters, the ones who had seen my Facebook post, were shifting uncomfortably. They knew where that wood came from, but no one said a word. Earl just gave me a sideways glance, his jaw tight. I discreetly leaned my walking stick against a patio chair, adjusting the angle until the camera had a perfect, unobstructed view of Marcia and the fireplace. The trap was set. The audience was seated. Now it was time for the show. "It's getting a little chilly," Marcia announced with theatrical flair. "Let's get this lovely fire started, shall we?" She picked up a long-stemmed lighter, the kind you use for fancy candles. She held it up for a moment, a queen about to bestow a great gift upon her subjects. She leaned down, the white of her pantsuit almost glowing in the dusk, and touched the flame to the kindling she had placed under my logs. The kindling caught, little orange flames licking at the dry bark. For a few seconds, everything was normal. The fire crackled softly. Marcia stood up, brushing her hands together, a look of immense satisfaction on her face. Then it happened. It started with a low hiss, and then a brilliant, searing white light erupted from the fireplace, as if the sun had just exploded on her patio. It was followed an instant later by a deafening, hollow hump that rattled the glass in the patio doors. The sound was huge, but there was no force to it, just pure noise and light. A massive, swirling cloud of thick gray smoke billowed out of the fireplace, completely engulfing Marcia. It wasn't a fire. It wasn't an explosion. It was a spectacle. When the light faded a second later, the scene was chaos. People were yelling, ducking behind chairs. The beautiful white lights flickered and went out. The only light came from the few smoldering pieces of kindling left in the grate. The smoke began to clear, and Marcia was still standing there, frozen in shock. Her perfect hair was standing on end, and she was covered from head to toe in a thick layer of fine, gray soot. Her pristine white pantsuit was now a mottled, dingy gray. A long, jagged crack had appeared in the stone facade of her expensive fireplace. She let out a single, sputtering shriek. For a long moment, there was dead silence. The only sound was the faint chirping of crickets. Then, from the back of the crowd, someone snorted. It was followed by a nervous chuckle, then another. Within seconds, the entire patio was filled with laughter. Not polite titters, but deep, rolling, unstoppable laughter. The fear she had cultivated for so long had been broken by the sheer, stunning absurdity of it all. Phones started to appear, their small screens lighting up faces as people hit record, capturing the image of the soot-covered HOA president standing in the ruins of her own party. I reached down, calmly picked up my walking stick, and pressed the button to stop the recording. My evidence was secure. The emergency HOA meeting was called for the very next night. The chaos from the barbecue had spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Marcia, apparently after a long shower, had gone on the offensive. She'd called the police, claiming I'd planted an explosive device in her fireplace. She'd sent out a hysterical, all-caps email to the entire HOA mailing list, accusing me of domestic terrorism and demanding my immediate expulsion from the community. The air in the clubhouse basement was thick with tension. It was packed this time, standing room only. Everyone was there. Marcia sat at the head table, her face a rigid mask of fury. She had Carl Jensen, her pet enforcer, standing behind her like a Secret Service agent. His arms crossed over his chest, but the smug confidence was gone. It had been replaced by a wild, desperate look in her eyes. She banged a gavel on the table, the sound cracking through the murmuring crowd. "This meeting will come to order," she snapped. "As you all know, we were the victims of a malicious and dangerous attack perpetrated by one of our own residents." She pointed a trembling, accusatory finger at me. "Tom Branson tried to blow me up." A few gasps went through the room, but they were mixed with skeptical whispers. The laughter, from the night before, still echoed in everyone's memory. I didn't say anything. I just stood up and walked to the front of the room. I had a small projector with me, one I used for looking at my woodworking schematics. I set it on the table and aimed it at the blank beige wall. "Before we get to that," I said, my voice calm and steady, "I have something I think everyone here needs to see." I plugged my phone into the projector. The first image that flashed on the wall was a time-stamped screenshot from my trail camera. It was Marcia, clear as day, on my property in the middle of the night, stealing my firewood. A wave of murmurs rippled through the room. That's just hazard abatement, she sputtered, her voice rising in pitch. It's in the bylaws. I didn't respond. I just clicked to the next slide. It was another screenshot, this time from the HOA's own Facebook page, showing Marcia's post about her EcoWood program, complete with a picture of her standing proudly next to a stack of my stolen logs. The wood was so distinctively stacked that everyone could see it was the same pile from the first picture. Now the murmurs were louder. People were starting to put the pieces together. Finally, I played the last video. It was the footage of her, just 3 nights before, cutting the lock on my back gate with a pair of bolt cutters. The snap of the chain cutting echoed through the quiet room. The collective gasp was audible. This wasn't abatement. This was breaking and entering. The room, which had been on her side out of fear, was turning. The laughter from the barbecue had broken the spell, and now the evidence was destroying her credibility piece by piece. Sandra Reeves, the quiet treasurer, was staring at the screen, her face pale. She wouldn't look at Marcia. "Now," I said, turning off the projector and facing the crowd, "let's talk about the explosion." I walked over to a duffel bag I'd brought and pulled out one of the special logs, a twin to the ones that had been in her fireplace. I held it up for everyone to see. "Marcia is right about one thing. I did put this in my woodpile. I knew she was stealing from me, and I wanted her to stop." Marcia shot to her feet. "It's a bomb. He's admitting it. Carl, call the police." Carl fumbled for his phone, his tough guy act crumbling into confusion. "It's not a bomb, Marcia," I said, my voice cutting through her hysteria. I unscrewed the end cap, just as I had for Earl, and poured some of the gray powder into my hand. "This is flash powder. It's a special effects pyrotechnic. Firefighters, like my son was, and our neighbor Earl here, use it in training simulations all the time to mimic the flash of a backdraft without the danger. It creates a loud bang and a lot of light and smoke, but it's harmless. It's about as explosive as a party popper. It's certainly not a weapon. It's a tool for demonstration." I looked over at Earl, who nodded in confirmation. "That's right. Perfectly legal, perfectly safe, when used correctly." The entire room was now staring at Marcia. The power had shifted so fast, it was like a physical force. The laughter and whispers had been replaced by a cold, angry silence directed entirely at her. They saw it all now. The lies, the theft, the abuse of power. She had stolen private property, lied about it, and then tried to have me arrested when her own theft literally blew up in her face. A woman in the front row stood up. "So, you used our HOA fees to post about an eco program that was just you stealing from your neighbor?" Another man yelled out. "And what about the liability? You took property from one homeowner and gave it to others. What if something had actually gone wrong? You could have ruined this entire association." The questions started coming from all sides, an avalanche of anger and betrayal. Marcia crumpled. Her face went slack, the fury replaced by raw panic. She looked to Carl for help, but he was already slowly backing away from the table. She looked at Sandra, but the treasurer just shook her head, a single tear rolling down her cheek. Marcia had no allies left. Her entire kingdom of fear and control had been built on a foundation of lies, and I had just kicked out the cornerstone. Just then, the doors to the basement opened, and 2 uniformed police officers walked in. Marcia's face lit up with a flicker of desperate hope. "Officers, thank goodness! Arrest this man!" she shrieked, pointing at me. The lead officer, a calm, tired-looking man, ignored her. He walked over to me. "Sir, are you Tom Branson?" "I am," I said. "We got a call about an explosive device," he said, looking at the log in my hand. "It's a pyrotechnic training tool, officer," I explained calmly. Earl stepped forward. "I can vouch for that. I'm retired fire department. We use that stuff for drills." The officer nodded, then turned his gaze on Marcia. "Ma'am, we also got about a dozen calls in the last hour about video footage being circulated. Something about trespassing and property theft." Marcia's mouth opened and closed like a fish. She had nothing left. The officer motioned to his partner. "Miss Kenton, I think it would be best if you came with us down to the station to answer a few questions. As they gently but firmly escorted a sputtering, defeated Marcia out of the room, a spontaneous cheer erupted. It started small, then grew into a full-blown ovation. They weren't just cheering for me, they were cheering for themselves, for the end of a long, petty tyranny. I just stood there, the heavy log still in my hand, feeling the weight of the past few months finally begin to lift. I stepped outside into the cool night air. The siege was over. Earl came up beside me and clapped me on the shoulder, his hand firm and steady. "You lit the fire, brother," he said. And for the first time in a long time, I smiled. Marcia didn't go quietly. Even after being released from the station pending investigation, she mounted one last, desperate offensive. She lawyered up and went to the local news, spinning a wild tale about a disgruntled neighbor who had been terrorizing her for months and had planted a sophisticated explosive device to harm her. She used all the right words: unstable, threat to the community, escalating behavior. She was trying to paint me as the villain, to turn public opinion back in her favor. For a few days, it was tense. A news van, parked at the end of our street. People I didn't know were driving slowly past my house. But her story was full of holes, and my quiet refusal to engage with the drama seemed to work against her. The real investigation was happening behind the scenes. 2 detectives came to my house. They were professional, serious men who had clearly seen it all. They didn't come in with sirens blazing. They just knocked on my door and asked if I had a few minutes to talk. I invited them in, offered them coffee, and led them to my workshop. I walked them through everything, step by step. I showed them the leftover materials, the canisters of magnesium and aluminum powder, all clearly labeled and legally purchased. I showed them my receipts. I pulled out the old Army training manual with the schematic for the flash simulator. I answered every question they had, plainly and honestly. I wasn't hiding anything. Earl came over and spoke to them as well, explaining the purpose of the device from a firefighter's perspective, verifying that it was a known training tool, not an improvised weapon. The detectives listened, they took notes, and they looked around my workshop. They saw a space that was organized and meticulous, the workshop of a craftsman, not a maniac. After about an hour, they closed their notebooks. "Mr. Branson," the older detective said, "your story is consistent with the evidence we found and with Mr. Bray's, Denton's statement. Miss Kenton's claims don't seem to be holding up." They left as quietly as they had arrived. 2 days later, the district attorney's office announced they were dropping the investigation against me due to lack of evidence. Instead, they were filing charges against Marcia Kenton for filing a false police report on top of the pending charges for theft and trespassing. The fire she'd tried to light under me had finally consumed her. The fallout at the HOA was swift and total. Marcia's last act before her resignation was made official was to empty her house and move out in the middle of the night. The moving truck was gone before the sun came up. Her reign was over. The remaining board members, a shell-shocked Sandra Reeves and a now powerless Carl Jensen, called another community meeting. But this one was different. There was no gavel, no agenda of violations. It felt more like a town hall. Sandra stood up, her voice shaking at first, but growing stronger as she spoke. She formally apologized to me and my wife on behalf of the HOA for the harassment and the baseless accusations. She admitted the board had failed in its duty to protect its members and had allowed one person's personal vendetta to spiral out of control. Then, she proposed a motion that the HOA's reserve funds be used to pay full restitution for all the illegal fines levied against me and to cover any of my legal expenses. The vote was unanimous. After that, they took nominations for a new board. My neighbors, in a display of solidarity that brought a lump to my throat, elected Earl as the new president. They elected 2 other reasonable, level-headed homeowners to serve with him. The reign of the clipboard was over, replaced by common sense and neighborly respect. It felt like breathing fresh air after being trapped underground. A few days later, there was a knock at my door. It was Sandra Reeves, holding something wrapped in a soft blanket. She looked embarrassed but determined. "Tom, she said, her eyes downcast. I went and got this from the police evidence locker. It should never have been taken. She carefully unwrapped the blanket. It was my son's sign. The thick, ugly white paint was still on it, but it was whole. It was back. I am so sorry for my part in all of this, she said quietly. I knew it was wrong. I was just afraid. I just nodded and took the sign. My anger at her had long since faded, replaced by a weary sort of pity. That evening, I took the sign into my workshop. I didn't try to sand off the white paint. That felt wrong, like trying to erase a scar. Instead, I took a fine brush and some black paint, and very carefully, very precisely, I traced the letters of Branson Firewood again, making them bold and clear against the white background. Then I repainted the little flame, making it a bright, defiant red. It wasn't the same as it was before, but it was still ours. The next weekend, the new HOA board, led by Earl, organized a neighborhood work party. They tore out Marcia's cracked and useless outdoor fireplace and, in its place, built a simple, beautiful community fire pit in the common green space behind our houses. It was a circle of fieldstone, open and welcoming. When it was finished, Earl came to me. We were thinking, he said, that we need a place for this. He gestured to my son's refurbished sign, which I was holding. Together, we mounted it on a new cedar post right next to the pit, and underneath it, the new board had installed a small bronze plaque. It read, "In memory of all fallen firefighters who run toward the fire when everyone else runs away." That night, half the neighborhood was gathered around the new pit. The flames danced in the cool autumn air, casting a warm, friendly glow on the faces of my neighbors. Lisa was sitting beside me, her hand in mine, a peaceful smile on her face. I looked at Michael's sign, standing guard over the fire, and at the plaque honoring him and all the others like him. My fight had started with a piece of stolen wood, a private grief desecrated, but it had ended here, with a community reforged, with a shared light in the darkness. As I watched the embers swirl up into the night sky, I thought about the long, bitter journey it had been. Sometimes you don't need to shout to stand up for yourself. Sometimes you don't need to fight fire with fire. You just have to build something that burns brighter and warmer and truer than all of their lies.